Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I'm glad you're here. You've just tuned into one of the most important podcasts that you may ever listen to, because the purpose of this podcast is to provide a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. However, there are other important aspects to this podcast: community, education, and support. I believe that sharing our stories is one of the most important steps to healing, and my hope is that the SAS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. And my ultimate goal is to provide all of my listeners with insights, resources, and a supportive space where empathy, compassion, and understanding thrive. My commitment is to being there for all my listeners. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week talking to victims and survivors or interviewing experts and professionals in order to not only gain insights and information to help us on our healing path, but also to provide an education on being trauma-informed, working to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Whether you're aware of it or not, we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. So I encourage everyone to listen to this podcast. Whatever your experience is with rape or sexual assault, you are not alone, and we are all here for each other. Thank you again for being here. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 year-end episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is episode 64. And this week, I want to celebrate a year of exceptional growth and positive impact this podcast has made in the lives of everyone who's chosen to listen in. I started this podcast to provide a platform for victims and survivors to tell their stories of survival and healing from the atrocities of rape and sexual assault, but also to provide a forum for educating and better understanding the complexities, adversities, victories, and all the dynamics of surviving a rape or a sexual assault through a trauma-informed approach. A year ago, episodes of this podcast were being downloaded at a rate of about 650 times a month. Now, SAS is averaging over 2,000 downloads a month. The growth is phenomenal. Obviously, this podcast is resonating with people from all walks of life with all kinds of experiences regarding rape and sexual assault, and I can't thank you, my listeners, enough. As I mentioned earlier, I want to celebrate the growth of this podcast. And not only the growth, but also the reasons for and the impacts of this show. This week, I have compiled a collection of clips from various guests over the past year. As you'll hear from these clips, each of these guests have chosen to recognize and celebrate the SAS format and their healing from being part of this podcast. They have also noted the hosting, the purposes, and the successes of this podcast. And this collection is only a sampling of the many guests who've been on this show who have voiced similar sentiments. As the host, I couldn't be more thrilled and appreciative because it shows that my goals and purposes for this podcast are being met. Please take the time to not only listen to these former guests, but also subscribe to and rate this podcast. Then, tell everyone you know about how this podcast is changing lives and helping victims and survivors heal and grow. Thank you for being a listener of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. I'll catch you on the other side.
I just want to thank you for bringing that to a platform, because I think it's good to have the conversations, but the education piece is huge because sometimes people don't know why their body and brain are doing what they're doing. Just get a little information. It can really be a turning point in their recovery. And so I just want to commend you for that. I think that's huge.
It's the same thing we see with sexual assault victims. You're normal, and the reactions you had are normal reactions to abnormal events, and we can never lose sight of that. We can't get so administrative, procedural, and policy-driven that we forget that there are people in every one of these audience groups who this is the first time they're hearing this, and something's going to click, and it could absolutely put them back on the road of normalcy, right? A road of recovery. So I thank you, Dave, for getting this out. Thank you for inviting us and including us and getting this message out and bridging what you're doing in the sexual assault world, something that is really important to Nicole and I with what we're now doing in the Force Encounters world. And we're finding ways to marry those lessons learned up, and you've given us a great bridge to do that.
I love that you're giving these survivors a voice to help change what's happening on that end. And I work on survivors and them finding their own justice. It's about bringing both sides together because there's nothing wrong with survivors. You're not the damaged ones. And the justice system has its flaws, but their heart's in the right place. So let's bring them together, actually deal with the right problem, which is taking down the perpetrators.
I think this is where real change, real connection, even real healing in conversations like these can come from. And so I think it's an important part of my work as well. And so anytime you want to chat, you know that.
I appreciate how you show up in the world and what you do for survivors and to raise awareness. And thank you for the investment you make in people, not only in your role as an investigator when you were living that part of your life, but what you do now to drive awareness. It's incredible. And thank you.
It is healing, and I'm just glad that I can help other people just know that they're not alone. I think that's the worst part of being a victim or survivor is that, you think that you're the only one and there's nobody to talk to and there is no help out there, but there's a lot if you just reach out. We're here, ready, willing, and able to help you. And once we get hold of you, you're not going to be able to slip back. So.
I was especially intrigued given your law enforcement background. I would love to candidly be able to discuss with you those failures. I think we can move beyond sorry and openly look at a mistake is such a minor word for what they were, but those failures that happened and how they could have been avoided and how we can learn from them and how we have to learn from them. We can't keep doing things the way we've done them. There's not room for that anymore. There's nothing off the table. I'm comfortable with anything that you would want to ask.
Thanks for having me on. I always want to try be there for as many as I can. I'll always be a friendly ear for somebody. And sometimes that's all people need. They just need somebody to listen to them.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. And you can thank your guests because they gave me the courage and you gave me the courage to speak up. I feel safe with you because of your background and your training. I'm comfortable with opening up to you and your audience. And the biggest reason being, obviously, is thinking about those people that are currently victims in relationships that are going through this, that have no one to bounce off. They yet haven't spoken to anybody. And this is a really great, creative, positive, informative way for them to get some skills behind them to perhaps start talking about it and start choosing the people they might want to speak to. Love talking to you. We'll talk again. Thanks so much.
First of all, it's such a pleasure to be here with you because it's one of these things where there's certain people in this world that you just sort of connect with right from the very beginning. And that's the way I feel about you. Just from the very beginning, it was an immediate connection of just common purpose, common interests. And for the audience, I mean, Dave is more than just part of the Jan Broberg Foundation. He is an integral part of the Jan Broberg Foundation.
I just saw your podcast on Spotify. I'm not sure how I actually managed to see it. And I thought it sounds very interesting. I love the way that you talk about trauma and being trauma informed. And I wish that I had encountered back in 1980. And I love the people that you have had on. It's showing that things are changing. It's changing from talking about victim blaming. It's changing to understanding why people can't leave this situation. And I absolutely love your work.
Thank you for giving it a forum and a safe place for people to actually be able to express and tell their stories. It's important. Yeah.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity. I really enjoy being able to at least use what experiences I've had. And you and I are the same on this. We really want to help victims. That's why we're doing this, because we understand more than most because of our training of what they've gone through and just the difficulties that they still face every day. So if there's any little ray of information we can give them or nugget that will be helpful, then it's worth it. And that's what we hope to do.
It has been a pleasure to talk with you and learn more about what you do, but also get a chance to talk to your listeners. So thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
I'm really happy to have a chance to share my story, because if I had heard somebody's story like mine when I was going through the healing process, that would have made it so much easier. And I just don't want other people to suffer in the way that I did with doubting myself because of the circumstances of the story. So even though it's very hard to talk about publicly or privately, I'm really grateful for the chance to do this.
Well, the way I heard about the podcast is I connected with someone over Instagram who was actually a guest on one of your podcasts. And I listened to that episode, and then I started listening to another episode and another episode. And I realized some of the connections that you had. I was like, wow, I have a story too. And I'd like to share my story, on platforms that I don't have access to on my own. And so I reached out and we connected, and here I am. But I am so appreciative of you, and not just the way that you handle people and the fact that you are doing this podcast, but just the compassion with which you do so, and the fact that you're getting the word out and you're teaching people to be trauma informed. And if there were more people like you, the world would be so much better. And I would love to come back and talk about my progress. Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having me as a guest and for all your wonderful and insightful questions. I would love to hear what your listeners thought of this episode. And then if they have any questions, we can address anything that comes up and then add to it.
I think I mentioned earlier that I've seen some of your podcasts come through. To be honest with you, I would see it and you have an inviting face, somebody that you could talk to. And I think you learn to read that with the experiences that I've had across life, professional and personal. And I found that to be true talking to you as well. But I've always wanted to tell something of my story. I wanted to make it public. To me, it has always seemed like the ultimate goal in the healing process. It wasn't being able to stand in a court of law and tell this man how he did things to me and what the impact it had on me. None of that. I just need my story to get out. Mostly because I want other people who have felt like this, have felt trapped, who have felt like they were trying to pick the lesser of two evils, that actually they have important things to say that we all need to hear. By telling their story, very likely they're doing a big part to stopping this kind of violence, even if only in their small area. And to me, that's what's really important.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. As I mentioned before, I would greatly appreciate you subscribing to this podcast, rating it, and then telling everyone you know to also listen and subscribe. I'm looking forward to another great year of providing a weekly platform for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault, and I want to wish each of you a very happy new year. Please tune in next week for another powerful episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. And in the meantime, please do your part to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. A great way to do this is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. Check out the Start by Believing website for more information on this important campaign. We'll see you next week.